Much for joining us. I'm Kate Markert. I'm executive director here at Hillwood Estate Museum and Gardens in Washington, D.C. I know you know we're in Washington, D.C., but we have a whole lot of people on Zoom. So I just want to remind our Zoomers that we're in Washington, D.C. So we're really pleased for having this fantastic audience here, and then for all of our folks who are joining us by Zoom. Now, for those of you in the theater, I know you know what I'm going to say next. Be sure your phones are silenced. Okay, everybody look, because in 2 minutes, something's going to chirp or bark or, Now, for those of you at home, you can submit your questions via the Q&A function in Zoom whenever they cross your mind, and we will get to as many questions as we can, and I am fairly certain there will be a lot of them, but we'll be taking questions from both locations. So those of you here, wait until somebody comes with a microphone so that the people on Zoom can hear your brilliant question. Tonight's lecture is the first of a three-part series highlighting our current exhibition. I know I saw some of you in it tonight, Interwoven, a Tradition of Textiles. Yes, it's great, isn't it? Where's Megan? Megan's here. I know she's here. There will be one lecture a month this summer. So we'll start here with Elena, and then you can learn all about the remarkable artistry, technical mastery, and cultural importance of textiles across the centuries. In July, the author Nicole Narek will share stories of women exercising power and agency through textiles, as inspired by her book, With Her Own Hands, Women Weaving Their Stories. Then in August, join curator Jennifer Swope for a talk about the history behind the American textile tradition of quilts, exploring themes from her exhibition, Fabric of a Nation, American Quilt Stories. And of course, if you have not yet seen Interwoven, it's on view until, even if you have, it's on view until January 3rd. So be sure to return again soon, and please bring family and friends. So tonight, we're very happy to be hearing from Elena Kanagy-Loux. And in this talk, she is going to explore the popular stereotypes of lacemakers and their actual lived experience. So she'll be pulling back layers of misconception to illustrate lacemakers' creativity, ingenuity, and resilience. Women have all of that, right? Now, before I turn over the mic, you probably know a lot of this, but I want to be sure to tell you a bit about Elena. Elena Kanagy-Loux is a PhD student at Bard Graduate Center, whose research into global lace history and the lives of lace makers is grounded in her own experience as a maker. After earning a BFA in textile design from the Fashion Institute of Technology, she won a grant which funded a 4-month trip. What she did with this 4-month trip, unbelievable. To study lace making across over a dozen, think about that, 4 months, a dozen countries. And then upon returning to New York, she co-founded the Brooklyn Lace Guild, an organization dedicated to the preservation of making lace by hand. In 2018, she completed her MA in costume studies at NYU and began working as the collection specialist at the Antonio Ratti Textile Center at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. That year, she was also commissioned by Columbia Law School to create a custom handmade lace collar, yes, I see you all nodding, to honor the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the occasion of her 25th anniversary of becoming a Supreme Court justice. Then in 2022, she was commissioned by the Bard Graduate Center Gallery to create a piece of lace to open the exhibition, Threads of Power, Lace in the Textile Museum, St. Gallen. her red silk bobbin lace collar depicting the story of Judith slaying Holofernes drew inspiration from a piece of 17th century Venetian needle lace in the Textile Museum's collection and took 200 hours to complete. She knows whereof she speaks. Now, please join me in welcoming Elena Kanagy-Loux to the podium.
Okay. All right. Well, first of all, I want to thank Kate Markert for such a beautiful introduction, and thank you to Megan Martinelli and everyone here at Hillwood for inviting me to speak tonight. It really is an honor. And thank you to everyone in the audience, both here in person and online. I'm so excited that you're all here with me tonight. So, of course, you've just heard a little bit about my background. Oh, I have to move my slides forward. Okay, I'm getting the hang of it. This was my introduction slide. We heard this. This image is actually, it's a really beautiful 19th century painting of lacemakers in Palestrina, which if you're familiar with Venetian lace, you might be familiar with Burano, which is a tiny little island where they make needle lace. But lesser known is the island of Palestrina in Lido in the south, where they made bobbin lace. So this is a painting depicting that. And it's actually for sale on First Dibs for $12,000. So if anyone wants to help me celebrate my 40th birthday this year, I would be open. Just teasing. So anyway, moving on. So you've just heard a little bit about myself and my background. So I've included some images of the work that you just heard about here, the collar for Justice Ginsburg and the red collar depicting Judith and Holofernes. But I just wanted to start out to say that as a lacemaker and historian, I approach all of my work through the lens of making. So most of my research focuses on the lives of lacemakers, which includes very heartbreaking and very beautiful stories. It's a complicated history. So that's primarily what I'm going to speak to you about tonight. And having just gone through the absolutely beautiful exhibition earlier, I was delighted to learn that Marjorie Merriweather Post was also an avid maker, including knitting, crochet, needlepoint, and even a little lace, if you saw the show. So even though this lecture isn't specifically about her collection, I hope to honor her and all of the women around the world who've made lace throughout history through this talk. So starting off here, looking at these two images, which one is true and which one is fiction? The left might be more what we expect, but the right is equally true. The reality is that lace history is as multifaceted as human history, and lacemakers came from all walks of life. Independent, poor, young, old, and cloistered. Today, I will unpack 3 stereotypes of lacemakers that I've encountered repeatedly during more than a decade of research, and touch upon their more nuanced realities. 1, that lacemakers were simply ladies of leisure or domestic hobbyists who didn't really contribute substantially to culture or to the economy. 2, that lacemakers all went blind by 30, which, believe it or not, is a comment that I've received repeatedly across social media platforms. And 3, that lacemaking is an exclusively European or even specifically Western European technique. So to that end, I will just start by saying a very abbreviated introduction to the development of lace techniques. And as far as lace goes, lace is unusual because it really is an umbrella term for a variety of textile techniques that are used to create aesthetically similar openwork textiles that are structurally very different. So my abbreviated definition is that lace is a textile in which the pattern is defined by the spaces between the threads. And that can include a lot of things. So I will be focusing, at least in the first section, primarily on needle and bobbin lace, which are featured beautifully in the exhibition. But I want to mention a couple of lace techniques that developed elsewhere. So the Andes are renowned for being a center of incredibly complex and diverse textile production for millennia, including spinning, weaving, knitting, embroidery, and unsurprisingly, lace techniques. So excavations have uncovered these woven gauzes that are darned with little figural motifs and geometric patterns, like the one you see here on the left, And these date to between the 11th and 15th century, and they're very structurally adjacent to 16th century Italian burato lace, although the two civilizations never had contact. So it just goes to show humans love to make beautiful decorative textiles. That's just in our nature. And then the image on the right is a piece of sprang, which is an ancient intertwining and interlacing technique that developed independently all the way from Egypt to Scandinavia and throughout the Americas. And this is an interlaced sprang fragment made from milkweed and other native fibers dating to around 1400, which was excavated from the Spiro burial mounds in present-day Oklahoma. So both needle and bobbin lace techniques, arguably, I won't be arguing here, but feel free to argue amongst yourselves, developed in northern Italy in the early 16th century, seemingly as part of a zeitgeist of openwork textiles that were growing in popularity at that time. So bobbin lace, which you see here, and is my specialty, although I make all kinds of textiles, I love all of them. Bobbin lace developed out of multi-strand braiding techniques related to passementerie. So if you think of the sort of ornamental gold braid, the sort of trimmings on military uniforms or on fancy Victorian couches, that would be like a braided passementerie. So these became increasingly complex until it was necessary to wind the individual threads around bobbins to keep them organized. So it's really, the bobbins are for thread management. And then the pairs of the bobbins which are typically made of wooden bone, are hung onto pins on a firm base and then crossed and twisted in the right or left direction to create an endless variety of patterns. The development of lace coincided with the new availability of printed pattern books, which were widely circulated across Europe and included many designs for elaborate cutwork and needle lace, as well as bobbin lace techniques that were touted as popular hobbies for noblewomen. These books did not include any instructions, so they required quite a high degree of knowledge to interpret, which tells us something, right? There's an expectation that the people who are consuming these are already very skilled. The first bobbin lace pattern book, La Pompe Opera Nova, was published in Venice in 1557 by the Sessa brothers. There's a pattern in the middle here is from that book, although the designer's name is not recorded, just the publisher. However, the Swiss bobbin lace pattern book from 1561 that you see on the left describes the arrival of bobbin lace from Venice in 1536, which is a very early date for lace to have recorded. And it was designed by a woman known only by her initials, RM, and includes one of the first, or arguably the first, depiction of bobbin lace making in the frontispiece here. So in contrast, needle lace developed from cutwork and drawnwork embroidery, wherein the pattern is marked onto plain weave fabric and threads are then cut and pulled out of the design, after which the voided areas are embellished with buttonhole stitches. And due to the wasteful process of discarding so much linen, eventually the base fabric was done away with entirely. So if you think about it, this is a time period where a linen shirt took an acre of flax to make. And this would be like years of labor. You have to grow the flax, you have to red it, you have to process it, you have to spin it, and then weave it, and then you're cutting it up and throwing out the threads. So somebody realized, let's try this with just on the pattern base. So that's what you're seeing here. This is the hands of one of my teachers, Marisa Situri, who I studied with on my trip in Venice. And this is a Burano style needle lace, although we were in Vicenza, which is not in Venice, just outside. And this took her 3 months with 60 years of experience. So that's how fast you can get, really. But I digress. So essentially, this new needle lace technique developed where you're working directly onto a pattern by couching outline threads around the motifs and then filling it in with rows of buttonhole stitches going back and forth, which is what she's doing here. Which is why one of the earliest forms of needle lace is called punto in aria, or stitches in air, because the stitches are worked in the air. They're not pierced through the base. So then when she's finished, she can turn this over and snip the couching threads out and release the lace many, many hours later. So So this is an example of some needle lace pattern books. So this incorporates both the scalloped border of both of these examples are made in true detached needle lace stitches. And then the sort of interior of these textiles are the cutwork technique called reticella that it developed out of. So this is just to give you some examples. And the pattern book on the left is another rare named designer, Isabella Catanea Parasole, sometimes known as Elisabetta. She was very prolific. She was not only a lace designer, but an engraver. So she did her own engravings and designing. And during her lifetime, she was really quite well known and worked for botanical artists doing engraving and things like that. So we have a number of pattern books from her. And of course, they're all out of copyright. So you can find them online if you want to try your hand. So jumping over to Flanders, we're going to do a lot of jumping around the world tonight. The proliferation of portraits of domestic servants from the early modern period is a testament to the way in which working class girls and women captured the public imagination, specifically in terms of lace making. There are so many portraits of lace makers from this period. I tried to put one lecture about it once and it just became too unwieldy. But early modern Dutch and Flemish painters in particularly were enamored with the subject of female domesticity, depicting lace makers like these in docile solitude. And one of the most prolific artists in that genre is Nicolas Mas, whose painting is at the Met, and it's the one on the left here. So what's interesting is that both paintings include, both of these are by Nicolas Mas. Getting a little mixed up here. I'm sorry. This is what happens. I write out my detailed notes and then I'm just talking to you at the same time. But I digress. So basically, what's interesting is that in these two portraits, you can see here that they're actually in a very similar setting. So scholars have identified that they're in the same room with the same engraving behind them and they have similar tools. So this suggests to us that this might actually be staged and not a real setting. There's more evidence to that. The presence of a toddler in the portrait on the left might lead us to conclude that this is a mother and child in a domestic setting, but closer examination reveals an alternative explanation. Both the lacemaker on the left and the servant on the right are also depicted wearing loose red wool jackets with rolled sleeves, which were typically worn by working classes due to their practical need for movement. And the fact that they're wearing separates rather than full single silk gowns, which were more fashionable in this particular time period, is another indicator of their different status. So I would suggest that actually Maes's lacemaker, as seen again here on the left, is actually a servant working for the household. So not actually a mother with her child. So what is real and what is an idealistic image imagined by the artist? It's not to say that lacemakers didn't work in domestic settings like in the image on the left, but the story of the image on the right represents more of the majority, and yet it's lesser known. This painting is of the Orphan Girls at Work from 1676, and it's part of a triptych by Johannes de Made that was recently restored and is now part of the permanent collection at the Magden House in Antwerp. Established in 1530, the Magden House served as a home for impoverished girls to educate and train them in domestic skills to eventually work as maids in wealthy households. But as lacemaking developed into the most valuable industry in the region, eventually lacemaking became the sole focus of their education. So they didn't necessarily learn reading, writing, arithmetic anymore. They were just producing lace. Here the girls sit in rows at their lace pillows while desperate parents bring their daughters to the wealthy region of the school, whose wife is dressed in expensive lace. Although working conditions declined in the 17th century, lacemaking was still preferable for many young women because it was done indoors while sitting down, and the students earned enough money to set themselves up for their future. So this is just to show you an example. There's some beautiful lappets and cap crown in the show. If you haven't seen it yet, maybe you've seen them. This is not the same technique, but it's a similar technique called Mechlin. So I just wanted to examine this with you a little bit and see what can we learn from examining an example of the kind of lace that these lace makers might have been making. So first of all, that lace makers were incredibly skilled. You cannot learn to make this technique casually or work on it sporadically, although I sometimes work on my lace sporadically, but I'm not as talented as these lace makers. You need to apprentice for years, just like any male artisan, except for lace makers were barred from creating guilds of their own to organize in that way. So this cap was made in 3 strips, as you can see in the caption, 3 strips using 500 bobbins each, which allows multiple hands to work on it at once, which is another sign that this is from a professional workshop, of course. My mentor, Devin, who has had 50 years of lace making experience, took a Mechlin class, that's this technique, in Belgium, and it took their group several days just to make a postage stamp. So once you know how much labor goes into this process, it's obvious that this was a professional industry and not something that casual makers could do on the side. But as I mentioned, lace making was preferable to many other occupations available during the time period, like domestic work and agriculture. And in fact, in March of 1590, the city of Ghent in Belgium enforced an ordinance against lace making as an occupation when citizens could no longer find housemaids because lace making was more lucrative. So according to the ordinance, only girls under 12 could continue to make lace, and older girls were ordered to basically report to the city and have it determined whether it was acceptable for them to continue. So, I mean, certainly, had I the choice, this would be preferable, perhaps. But perhaps the most compelling story to highlight how important lace was to the international economy in the early modern period is that of this lace gown made for Maria Theresa of Austria in the 1740s. So the Ghent government owed a tax debt to the Habsburg Empire that they couldn't afford to pay outright, and commissioned their lace makers to produce a lace gown for the empress instead. And there's a reason why there's a vanishingly small number of full lace garments from the 18th century, as even small lace accessories like cuffs and collars cost an absolute fortune. So this is arguably one of the only examples that we find, especially in a technique this labor intensive. Multiple lace makers worked on the dress over 5 months, which was valued at over 25,000 guilders. And it's impossible to accurately translate historical currency precisely, but I've seen this put in the ballpark of about $1 million today. So she was painted wearing it twice, and one of the portraits stayed in Ghent and the other to Vienna. And there's a few fragments that survive of this gown, one of which is this potentially sleeve fragment in the Metz collection. So you can see the design up close. Really incredible. So during the 17th century, the 3-dimensional needle lace technique Gros Point de Venise was all the rage with European nobility. And accessories made in this technique could easily be the most expensive item in a wardrobe inventory. A single braccia, or arm's length, of the exquisite lace cost around 360 ducati, or gold coins, the equivalent of 10 years of a laborer's wages, reflecting the huge investment of time to stitch it. It was made by couching outline threads to a base pattern, filling in the motifs with buttonhole stitches, but then building up these 3-dimensional outlines with bundles of cut threads covered in dense stitches, this is fiddly enough, but that makes it extra fiddly. But it really does have this sort of quality of being so sculptural. It looks like it was carved out of ivory. And in fact, it even inspired the woodcarver Grinling Gibbons to carve a lace cravat that you see on the left here that Horace Walpole actually wore at dinner parties. So, so it made a big impact. But according to Pat Earnshaw, a square inch of this lace could contain up to 6,000 stitches. And actually, my aforementioned lace mentor Devin and I have done some calculations based on examples in the mat, and that does in fact hold to be a pretty solid average for these. So it's incredible amount of work. So who made this? In Catholic countries, lace making was centered around the church, taught and produced primarily in convents or in charitable institutions. In the mid-16th century, Venice had the largest population of nuns per capita in Europe, totaling over 30 recorded convents and housing about 2,500 nuns. This was thanks in part to the practice of families involuntarily sending their young daughters to the convent, as the fee for entering was lower than the cost of a wedding and a dowry. Perhaps the most famous involuntary nun of the 17th century is Arcangela Tarabotti. I included this because there isn't an image of her. This was believed to be of her. It's actually on her biography, but it's actually Catherine de' Medici dressed as a nun. But just to give you an idea, this is the vibe. So she was born into an aristocratic family in 1604 and placed in a convent when she was only 11 years old, probably due to her physical disabilities, which was sadly a common practice. But she was undeterred. She became very well educated. She corresponded with the great minds of her day, and she was very strongly an early advocate for women's rights. I wouldn't even call her a proto-feminist, but just a straight-up feminist. And she authored 5 books on that subject during her lifetime, while also overseeing the convent's lace workshop. It's so rare to have any lacemaker's voice from this early, or even like lace maestra, so it's really invaluable to us. France entered the lacemaking industry relatively late, but made no less of an impact. Realizing how much the nobility's wealth was being spent on this imported textile, in 1660, Louis XIV banned foreign lace, but the demand was too great, and the fashionable elite found a way to smuggle it into France. Actually, his predecessor, Louis XIII, also banned it, and that time around, there's this great prose poem written about like the anthropomorphic laces being rejected from France. They have to sail back to Venice because the lace is banned. It's called La Révolte de Passement, or the Revolt of the Passementerie, if you're interested. It's a great little ditty. But then Louis XIV had a different idea. So along with his finance minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the king realized that if you can't beat him, join him. And in August 1665, they issued a decree establishing a royal lace manufactory in several cities in France, including Alençon. Master lacemakers from Flanders and Venice were brought in to train local women in the new style, which the Venetian Republic regarded as espionage. This was their biggest financial export at the time, actually. So despite the threat of capital punishment, the French plan was carried out, and fashionable taste shifted towards the new lace, Point de France, which you see on the right here. And over time, even some Venetian laces came to be known with French names, which is why we now say Gros Point de Venise instead of Punto Relievo, which is the technique we just looked at. So Alençon needle lace is incredibly still produced today in France under a government-run manufactory. And it's so fine that the school reports that it takes 7 hours to produce a single square centimeter. So I don't know if maybe you've heard of this play. Just we're shifting into the second question of my presentation, or the second topic. But last year, I caught a performance of Lacrima, a contemporary play that tells the story of a royal wedding ensemble made with Alençon and Alençon lace and Indian embroidery. And a central narrative is that the lace makers and one embroiderer are slowly going blind due to their labor, which is a trope that I encounter often and I wanted to explore in my research. So we see this trope all across pop culture, and I get comments about it in social media, so it has really sticking power. When I first started making TikTok videos back in 2020 about lace history, I got tons of comments about the Madeline movie Lost in Paris from 1999, which I had actually never seen, but I had to immediately go and watch it. And basically, it's a story in which Madeline is kidnapped, and she's told she's going to meet her. It's very heartbreaking, actually, when you think about it for a children's show. She's told she's going to be introduced to a relative, but she ends up being kidnapped and forced to make lace in a basement. And they tell her that if she's bad, that they'll make her make black lace, which will make her go blind. They also say that they're going to cut her red hair and make it into very expensive lace, which was a real thing. People did make hair lace, but none related to kidnapping that I've ever heard about. But anyway, so that was one trope. And then in doing some more digging, there's also an episode of Friends where Rachel is telling people about her wedding, but she's making up all of these details about it, where she tells these people at a party that her veil was made by blind nuns in Belgium, that they went blind, but that it was so beautiful and important to them that they were happy to do it. So again, I was like, where is this coming from? It's such a strange narrative. And of course, as I mentioned, these are very labor-intensive things that are hard on your eyes. I understand how this would cause eye strain, but why has this become such a sensationalized narrative? So, first of all, It's important to note that techniques like bobbin lace are actually very tactile. So you pre-prick the pattern card before you start making lace so that you can feel the pins with the pinhole. So you actually don't need to be looking quite as closely as perhaps you would with needle lace, where you have to insert the pin over and over, or the needle over and over again. And in fact, as I've discovered, lace making was sometimes taught to blind people for this very reason, because bobbin lace is so tactile. So I found this incredible portrait. I haven't found much information about it, but of a school for blind lace makers in Italy in the 1880s. And then when this always happens, I was met someone at a lace class I was teaching, and she told me the story that her grandmother's friend, this would have been, I think she guessed, around the turn of the century, who was blind, was also a crochet lace maker. And she had inherited this doily that her friend had made from her mom. So, this showed me that there are the possibilities for makers who are already blind. So I was curious, if it is something that you don't necessarily need to see, then where is this coming from? So the earliest potential source I've been able to find thus far is this article from the 1870s, which specifically states that Valenciennes lace makers commonly went blind by 30, but with no citation to back it up. Unfortunately, in 19th century history, they rarely cite anything. It's really difficult for us today. But Valenciennes is a similar type of lace to the technique that I showed earlier of the Mechlin cap crown that's made with many, many bobbins. So the technique requires approximately 800 bobbins per 4-inch width. And Pat Earnshaw, who's a late great British lace historian, described it taking one lace maker working 15 hours a day for 10 months to make a set of engageants or sleeve ruffles. So when I've come across actual records of a lace maker going blind, these are stories from their relatives, and they lack medical records to indicate the cause. So this could have been due to an illness, genetics, or poor conditions like low lighting. We'll talk about that. But one specific record I came across of a lace maker who went blind is an English woman named Mary Carrell, who was active around the turn of the century. And her granddaughter recalled that she made colorful lace so that she could see it better while her eyesight was failing. And several other family members also made lace, but none of them are documented as losing their sight. But there's something else that significantly impacted the lives of lace makers, their working conditions, and how they were perceived: the Industrial Revolution. After many attempts at replicating lace structures by machine, John Heathcote invented the bobbinet machine in 1808, which produced an unembellished hexagonal tool based on point ground bobbin lace. Soon after, many lace makers transitioned to making tambour and needle run laces, in which they stitched by hand onto a machine-made tool ground. However, this work paid much less than making bobbin and needle lace, because that previously had no competition, and they were also paid less than the male machine operators. By 1840, however, jacquard technology had been applied to the bobbinet machine, and the machines like the levers and pusher machine could now produce fully mechanized figural woven lace that imitated certain varieties of bobbin lace very accurately. So, not coincidentally, this decade of European history is known as the Hungry 40s, a period in which handcraft workers struggled to feed their families under the onslaught of mass production. But some artisans had already anticipated this decades before and fought to stop it. So you've probably heard of the Luddites, maybe pejoratively, although I hope we can start to think about them a little bit differently in the onslaught of AI these days. So this was a movement of workers who rose up against exploitative factory owners in England in the 18 teens, famously smashing machines that had automated them out of work and into starvation. Not only did they target lace machines in addition to automated looms, but there's also documentation that some Luddites wore women's clothing during raids. You can see a satirical print from a newspaper of a Luddite in a polka dot dress and a bonnet in front of a burning factory. Some scholars believe that this was a way to honor one of the first jobs to be automated during the Industrial Revolution: spinning, as it was predominantly an occupation held by women and girls. But there's another potential explanation as well. Some scholars believe that these may have actually been women fighting against the destruction of their own jobs. So the mystery continues. Either way, Luddites were right to be worried, as the dawn of the factory age brought on acute suffering far exceeding that of earlier centuries due to dire conditions, long hours, and meager wages. While there are records of illness and poor conditions from earlier centuries, this was really exacerbated by the Industrial Revolution because, again, they had no competition previously, and now they had to keep up with machines. So an 1860 survey of several thousand children who made lace in England found a high rate of death from pulmonary diseases, and complaints of headaches and eye strain were common. But the most common illness recorded among lacemakers was TB. So that was heartbreakingly the main thing that I've been able to find. So these types of illnesses were linked to demanding schedules and meager diets, which included the denial of meals by certain cruel lace mistresses when lacemakers were not meeting production deadlines. However, lacemakers continued to be a source of fascination in popular media and idealized in paintings like this one on the right here, even as their conditions worsened. In the close of the 19th century, folklorists began to realize that the traditions developed by lacemakers over generation were on the verge of disappearing. So they set out to document lace songs and tells. Lacemaker songs were often tied to festivities like St. Anne's Day, one of the patron saints of lacemaking, who's celebrated in Belgium. They often also chanted lace tells along with their stitches, which were not songs, but recitations like nursery rhymes that helped them to count the number of pins that they were inserting as they worked. So this was important to keep pace because lace mistresses expected them to insert 10 pins each minute or 600 every hour. And then on the left, we have a lacemaker's lamp here. They're also used by watchmakers in Switzerland. So comparable skill kind of situation that you need to see very well for. Lacemakers' lamps like these projected beams of lights onto individual pillows, as many as 8 at a time, which helped lacemakers to see the minute stitches even while working late into the evening. And they're also related to a ritual on St. Catherine's Day or on Candlemas where they would be allowed to start using candles in winter since they were very expensive, where they would jump over the candlestick as part of the festivities. So that's related to the nursery rhyme, Jack jump over the candlestick. Everything comes together in lace. New techniques also emerged during this period of the Industrial Revolution as well, such as Irish crocheted lace, which developed during the period of the Great Hunger in the 1840s. Based on three-dimensional Venetian techniques, it was made using a crochet hook to speed up the process, and it took the world by storm. I'm actually wearing Irish crochet lace tonight, and there's beautiful examples in the exhibition as well. Not only did it help to feed Irish families, but it expanded internationally. We'll see an example of a country you'll never guess in the upcoming slides. So it really became a massive industry. There was a huge demand for it. Very influential. Although machine lace had undercut the prices of handmade lace in Europe, the desire for handmade lace remained. So production was outsourced to the colonies where it could be produced much more cheaply. Not so different from the garment industry today, unfortunately. And this was nothing new, as many European countries like Spain had already introduced bobbin lace to the Americas in the 17th and 18th centuries, and it quickly took root in countries like Mexico and Peru. Given their long histories of skilled textile production, it's no surprise that this developed into many unique regional laces. For example, a 16th century Spanish drawn work technique developed into Tenerife lace, named for the island in the Canaries. And over time, it spread across the Spanish Americas and took on distinct characteristics. So here in Paraguay, it developed into a style known as ingenuity, which is the indigenous Guarani word for a spider's web. And unlike Tenerife lace, which is made on a small wheel-shaped tool, ingenuity is made on an embroidery frame, which allows an endless variety of the shapes and patterns. So not only circles, but they do text, figures, all kinds of things in ingenuity. In Brazil, bobbin lace making was introduced by the Portuguese as early as the late 16th century, and its production is still centered in the northeastern region of Ceará, the ancestral home of the Tupinamba people. Indigenous Brazilians were known for their complex and colorful featherwork, which provided hugely influential on the development of the European featherworking trade in the early modern period. Indigenous Brazilians quickly adapted to bobbin lace techniques, often with a vibrant color palette that very clearly draws upon their heritage. And their tools traditionally incorporate local plant life, including bobbin pillows stuffed with palm leaves, bobbins weighted with Brazil nuts and cactus thorns as pins. Another technique that is distinctly Caribbean is lace bark. Native to Jamaica, Haiti, and Cuba, the leggeta tree grows a lacy fiber within its branches. Unlike most other forms of bark cloth, which have to be heavily processed to produce a soft textile, lace bark unfurls like magic after the bark is peeled away and is soaked and stretched to create a delicate natural mesh. Lace bark had a variety of uses by the indigenous Taino people, such as sieves for cooking and butterfly nets, among other utilitarian purposes. But over time, lace bark production became a source of income and personal expression for Black women who used it to fashion ethereal accessories for themselves and for export. Today, the survival of the leggeta tree is threatened, but botanists and historians like Steve Buckridge are working to protect its natural habitat and preserve the heritage of lacebark. They actually thought it was extinct, but they found like 2. So amazing how things can change. Asia was also home to a number of different lace industries, primarily introduced in the 19th century. After the Meiji Restoration in 1868, several lace workshops were established in Tokyo and neighboring Yokohama as part of larger efforts to westernize Japan. Established by the Japanese government in 1880, the Tokyo Prefecture Lace Manufacturing School initially limited enrollment to daughters of former samurai, who sought to preserve their elite status by adapting to Western culture. Although the school taught a range of British and Irish lace techniques, they excelled at Honiton, seen on the right here. It's a bobbin lace technique. An English bobbin lace technique made in Devon, which they produced in designs incorporating traditional Japanese motifs such as cranes and cherry blossoms. And then on the left, we have the example I mentioned of Irish crochet made in Japan. So this is the country that maybe you guessed, but maybe not. So sisters Suzu and Sumi Takagi trained in Irish crochet lace techniques at the Sundai Ewa Girls' School in Yokohama in the 1890s, ultimately launching a business called Mrs. Takagi Lace Co. to cater to foreign residents in Yokohama. They even presented a lace fan to Empress Teime at the enthronement ceremony of Emperor Taisho that took 3 years to produce. The English also introduced lace making to India under their colonization, and after their native textile industries were essentially wiped out by the Industrial Revolution, then the Bengal famine, including the centuries-old industry of incredibly fine cotton weaving, which people are working to revive today wonderfully. Lace making was introduced to employ women and girls, particularly in the South around Narsapur, as a way to pull women and their families out of poverty. Today, Indian artisans are famous worldwide for their skill in producing textiles for the haute couture runway in Paris. And Nida Garg Allen of Marasim Atelier, you can see her hand on the left, continues to work with lace makers in India, where she's from, who produce exquisite garments made of handmade textiles, including lace, for brands like Oscar de la Renta and Bodhi. A parallel scenario to India was introduced in the US with the Sybil Carter Indian Lace Association. Sybil Carter was an Episcopalian missionary who began teaching lace making to Ojibwe and Oneida women in the 1890s, and eventually set up an organization with schools across reservations from California to New York that sold lace to wealthy white women on the East Coast. Much of the lace they made was based on historical patterns, including this piece on the top left, which is a reproduction of a piece of 17th century bobbin lace in the Met's collection. And of course, this has a very problematic history, and they had quite patronizing attitudes toward the lace making, towards some of the lace makers. But in fact, some Native communities, such as the Oneidas, have really taken on this technique as their own and continue to make and celebrate their lace history to this day. So the late 19th and early 20th centuries marked a period of widespread efforts to preserve and revive lace making in Europe and beyond after the introduction of machines. The successes of this philanthropic movement were severely curtailed by the onset of World War I, but once again, efforts to support lacemakers amped up at this time. So after the German invasion in 1914, the Committee for Relief in Belgium was established by future President Herbert Hoover, and a special lace committee was created to support the lacemakers with sales to the US and UK. It was overseen by his wife, Lou Henry Hoover. And lacemaking in Belgium was already in decline due to competition from machines. And in 1911, an organization called Les Amis de Dentelle was also established by Queen Elizabeth of Belgium to support the industry. So they ended up hiring these incredible designers like Isidore de Rutter, who created this beautiful piece with, sea life in it, that this is in the collection of the Smithsonian today. That really, it's such an innovative time for lace, despite, the difficulty of the war. So despite the devastation of the war, the lace project was a major success, raising more than $1 million in proceeds for the lace makers and their families. And today, many examples of war lace survive in museum collections in the US and Belgium. So unfortunately, the Great Depression wiped out the last of the market for handmade lace, at least the large scale market. There's still a few brands out there that are producing lace by hand, as consumers struggled to feed their families. And by the second half of the 20th century, lace making was already being referred to as a lost or dead art. The archetype of the lace maker had become symbolic of passivity, and this is reflected in literature of the time, is in the case of the book, and which became a film, La Dentelière in French, or The Lace Maker in English. So the main character, Pomme, is not actually a lace maker, but descends into life-threatening eating disorder and requires psychiatric intervention after heartbreak from a neglectful man. So basically, the story is that lace makers are very fragile and vulnerable, and not that they are these dynamic and interesting and talented and creative artisans, which is one that is not the whole story again. So the negative baggage associated with lace making in this period was such that even during the fiber arts movement of the 60s and 70s, where you'd think that lace making would be celebrated, lace makers were actively excluded, and the technique was stigmatized as something for old ladies, which also, what's wrong with that? So in reality, lace makers of that period were just as innovative as other artists, coming up with incredibly modern designs, and they had their own movement internationally, creating designs, opening guilds, creating really innovative designs in lace. So for this example, I'm showing a piece by Luba Krejci, who was no wallflower, not certainly a tough and talented woman. She made incredible art, as living in Czechoslovakia at the time, and even was able to smuggle things out to a solo show at the Museum of, now MAD in New York City, but then the Museum of American Craft. But she still has not been given her due. So stay tuned for more 20th century lace makers who haven't really been appreciated yet. So to conclude, talk a little bit about lace making today. And today, lace making has been going through another revival, but thanks to the internet, it is much more inclusive and visible internationally than ever before. And there are too many artists that I could ever possibly name that are innovating in the technique, but I included this really beautiful piece of lace made from parachute cords recovered from World War II by my friend Pierre Fouché in South Africa. He is an incredibly talented artist and explores queer themes in his work. As you can imagine, the lace world today is, we come to this technique because of our genuine love and appreciation for it, and not by force, either of poverty or colonization. So we're able to choose to be lace makers, which is really an incredible thing. And then on the right, I will just show a picture. This is of my lace guild, some of the members of my lace guild here. We actually just celebrated on June 21st, not only International Lace Day and Father's Day, it was a big day, but also our 10-year anniversary as a guild. Now we have over 100 members. Very exciting. But we are by no means the only organization that is working to preserve lace making today. There are organizations like the International Organization of Lace, Inc., or IOLI, which is in the US, or OIDFA in Europe, the Adventurous Lace Makers, which is online and was started by Pierre. And then here in the DC area, if you're interested in learning and getting involved, the Chesapeake Region Lace Guild. So we have some representatives in the front here if you want to talk to them. So I know this was quite a whirlwind around the world, all different themes, all different topics, but I can't help myself because I have such a passion for lace that I have to talk about as many topics as I possibly can. And I just hope that this shows you how rich and how beautiful and how also ugly and difficult this history was. But really what I love about lace history is that it reflects all of the multifaceted nature of humanity. It really is the story of women. And these women it's long overdue to celebrate them. So Thank you.
The conversation. I know we want to be able to for you to ask your thoughtful questions. We want to ask that you speak into the microphone and raise your hand. If you have a question, I will pass you the microphone so that way everybody can hear your question. And also, we want our people on Zoom to also be able to answer the question as well.
Linda Kay. Oh, I think the mic is coming around. Yes.
So I noticed there's lots of difference in the style of bobbins. You touched on it briefly, but could you comment about um, the size and the kind of bobbins? And I've seen some with beads on too. Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. Yeah. So bobbins, like all of the different tools used in textiles, they really evolve in tandem with the technique itself. So you'll find bobbins that suit the characteristics of the lace or pillows that suit the characteristics of the lace in different regions. So the spangled bobbins are from the East Midlands. They're so beautiful. And the English love a decorated bobbin. They have commemorative bobbins for like Princess Diana, Queen Victoria. They are all out there. You can still order them. Chris Parsons, for example, and there's a number of great bobbin makers in the UK. But so the beaded ones are really to help keep them from rolling, because having them roll around can drive you bananas. And then the Belgian lace makers with their 500 bobbin wide lace are using the tiniest ones imaginable, whereas people working in more the Brazilian technique or in Eastern Europe with the big round pillows, they use very few bobbins at once. So those tend to be big and heavy because they're hanging. So it helps with tension. So but there's a whole world of lace bobbins.
Elena, I have a very basic question that just occurred to me during your talk. Why is most lace white?
Excellent question. Excellent question. So in fact, it's a little bit of survival bias and a little bit of ease of laundry. So a lot of the early bobbin laces you'll find, because they were developing in tandem with these sort of braiding techniques, were in silk, like polychrome silk or metal threads and things like that. But silk can be volatile and disintegrate, especially black silk. There's almost no black silk from before the 19th century. I think I know one piece from the 17th century that's in Antwerp that's really in terrible condition because the pigments eat away the fiber. And then sometimes the gold was actually melted down and reused during difficult times. So it doesn't necessarily survive. And then white linen, first of all, specifically linen, until this specific technique was developed to gas the fuzz off of cotton fibers, linen was like the perfect thread to make lace with, because linen it's actually stronger when wet. So it makes it really easy to clean these really delicate things that you would think are so fragile, and they are. But my Valenciennes lace teacher did say to me, she was like, "Oh, Valenciennes is so strong, you could beat it over a rock." And I was like, I won't do that. But it was helpful to make it in white linen so that you could, take it off your garments, put them back on, because you might have multiple garments, multiple sets of garments, one set of lace. So you're swapping it out. It needs to be cleaned. It's getting in your food, stuff like that. So having it be white was just really practical. So that's why I think it's ended up that way.
I'm going to jump in with a question from Zoom really quick. Someone wanted to know, historically, how much did bobbins cost? Were there craftsmen who specifically made bobbins, and were lace makers usually given their bobbins, or were they required to purchase them?
That's such a good question. I don't have a specific answer for how much they would have cost. I know that a lot of lace makers were in communities of craftspeople where men might have been wood turners. But lace bobbins could be made of different materials. There's even examples made of lead, glass, but those are more specialty. And then wood and bone were most common. It's really about knowing somebody to make them for you. And in England, where I said they love the decorated bobbins, they were also used for courtship. So if somebody was trying to hit on you, if they really liked you, they might they might turn you a beautiful bobbin and then engrave. I've seen this. This is a real one. Kiss me quick before mother comes. I own one that says, "Don't be shy." So I think it really was one of those things that it was a community effort. There were certainly lace makers who made their own tools in terms of like pillows and things like that, but the bobbins, you kind of had to know a guy who had a lathe.
What about pins?
Pins were expensive and they were labor intensive. So it was like 5 steps to make a pre-industrial pin. It was like 5 different people that were involved in it. So the early laces use fewer pins. The later ones use more once they're mass produced. Oh, I'm sorry. I have another question over here, but I can come back to you.
I have 3 questions. One is lots of times I see, and being half Belgian, the point de accent and point de quelque chose d'autre. Where does the point number one?
Mhm.
And is it like a city or is it some lady who was named? Number 2.
Okay.
Is it true that you actually, if you want your lace to go from white, having washed it too much over the years, you put it in a little tea? And number 3 is, do you in the lace from like maybe the mid 1800s to now, early 1900s, is that linen or is it cotton?
Great questions. So point just is a word used interchangeably with lace in a lot of early texts. And part of it has to do with the fact that a lot of early laces are little pointed edgings. So the etymologically lace words like dentelle is little teeth, kant in Flemish is or in Dutch is side, spitze is like points in German. So there's little points to lace, and then point ground develops, which is just a name for basically tool ground. But naming in lace is a whole can of worms that I won't get into. As for coloration, in the early modern period, people wanted their lace to be as white as possible, very much showing off your wealth and your cleanliness, things like that. So it was very important to launder it white. They used bluing agents, and there were specialized laundresses who worked specifically on lace washing. We weren't just going to give it to any laundress. But in the 19th century, it was very fashionable to have patinaed old lace. So people would dip it in tea and things like that. You can find advice about that in like the Queen Lace book from 1874. There was even a brief fashion for Isabeau lace, which was some historic queen who supposedly didn't bathe herself until her husband came home from the war. And so I think this was medieval and also apocryphal, but anyway, so she wouldn't have been wearing lace, but supposedly then her lace got dirty. So then it was fashionable to make your lace aged. And then the last question was, I'm so sorry, will you remind me? Oh, cotton. Yeah. So I mentioned briefly that, linen was really the best thing for lace, and it still really is great. But once they developed this technique to sort of like gas the fuzzy fibers off of cotton thread, because it was too fluffy previously in lace making, you don't want it to be fluffy. That once that technique was developed, I'm not sure the date, 1830s-ish, something like that, maybe a little earlier. Then it really switches over to cotton because the cotton industry is huge. I mean, thanks to, unfortunately, slavery, industrialization, all of that kind of those big global industries. So cotton kind of takes over. So a lot of 19th century laces are cotton or silk. Silk is another big one. Oh, yes, right here. There's the mic.
Thank you. This was so wonderful. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how societies distinguish between like lace making as trade and lace making as a craft for wealthy women. I'm wondering if there are specific kinds that were sort of appropriate for wealthier women to take part in, or where they sort of drew lines around those categories.
Great question. I mean, I think it really had to do with your access to skill. If you were able to learn a technique on either end of the spectrum, it was really dependent on, for working class girls and women, where you were born. So that region would dictate like what technique you made based on that area. But But I think in some cases, from what I've gathered, there's historically there was a class divide between sort of bobbin and needle lace, that needle lace was more popular with wealthier ladies because it shows off your hands more beautifully. You can do these really elegant needle lace stitches, whereas bobbin lace, you're making these little kind of club fists that don't look very nice. And if you look at, and so it's not very elegant. It's also not very portable. You know, it's kind of awkward to be, you're like, hold on. You know, it's harder to pause and things like that. So it's not conducive to being in that sort of environment. Not to say that there are certainly portraits with like wealthy daughters, like in rich families that are making bobbin lace, but maybe they would never be doing like a Mechlin cap that took 1,500 bobbins or something. They were making little edgings for their doll clothes or something. Yeah. So I think that's really where the divides lie.
I'm going to jump in with another question
Yeah.
from Zoom. Someone actually has a question about the Madeline movie. They want to know how accurate was the on-screen portrayal of the actual lace making process? Like, were the bobbins, the designs, like, was that all accurate?
Wildly inaccurate. Like the furthest from accuracy. So the design itself resembles reticella, which is like the 16th century Italian cutwork lace. And then there's like 5 bobbins coming off of it. Let's see if I can go back. But it really is, it's in any sort of media depiction, I can't think of any. See, that's not what it looks like. But, and you know what's funny? They weren't alone. There are depictions by artists from like the 17th and 18th century that they're showing lace makers, and they don't know what they're looking at either. They look like spiders. There's like threads going everywhere. There's bobbins at the back of the lace, but like at the finished end of the back of the lace, you know, sometimes you throw them out of the way, but they were totally confused what they were looking at. So that doesn't surprise me. So yeah, that is inaccurate. But I mean, I appreciate the effort.
This has been wonderful. Thank you. Quick question. What is the most popular design or motif, say in France or in Italy? Actually, primarily Italy, I guess. Was it flowers? Was there a specific motif, I guess?
It's very regionally specific, and it's specific to different periods. So, you know, the early lace, you see a lot of actually figural motifs, like the Judith slaying Holofernes piece that I based my commission on. That was from Italy from about 1600. That's very graphic and bold. It really doesn't look like the flowery kind of lace we're used to today. I think the Italians had a very kind of like heavy Baroque, organic, asymmetrical aesthetic, whereas the French do more like these tiny little fountains and crowns and very symmetrical. You know, and then the English famously, if you can identify every plant in the lace, it's English. Oh, that's a fern, it's an English lace.
We have time for one more question.
Yeah. Thank you. So actually kind of based on this veil sort of thing here from Friends, when did lace, right? So it's a history of women, but it both has like this virginal and sexy thing that happens to lace. So I guess, when does that happen? When does it become, right? Nuns were doing it. Then it's like, you know, you put it over your face at a wedding and then it becomes sexy in lingerie. So how does that happen?
That's a great question. I think that really doesn't develop until the 19th century. So it's sort of related to, as chemises, which tend to be linen chemises, tend to be quite large undergarments in the early modern period, that you have like velvet or silk clothing outside of them. And then that shrinks down and down and down until what we have is like lingerie today. So the lace on your chemise that used to be visible in the exterior by the 19th century, you've shrunk down into, you know, little camisoles and bloomers and things like that that still have lace trims, but they're no longer visible. So once it becomes like an internal thing, there's that sort of sexiness. And lace veils are not really a thing until the 19th century either. You know, Queen Victoria is the famous archetype of the sort of white wedding, and she does hire supposedly 250 Honiton lace makers to make her flounce, which is now in the Royal Collection Trust. And it's absolutely incredible. And she wore it all through her life. But I think that sort of push-pull tension doesn't happen until the 19th century, also because that's when men stop wearing lace mostly. And so once it becomes associated with women, then we have this sort of baggage of femininity that comes with it.
All right, let's please give a huge round of applause for Elena.